Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I'm Edward Lucas. I'm talking to you from London. I'm a senior fellow at the Centre for European Policy Analysis, and I'd like to welcome you to this discussion on the European Magnitsky Act and how we must sanction corruption. It's organised by three MEPs, Petros Austrevicius from Lithuania, Raphael Glucksmann from France, and Radosław Radek Sikorski from Poland. We're going to start off with brief opening remarks from those three, and also another one of our guests, Bill Browder, the human rights activist and the man who established the concept of Magnitsky sanctions. And then we'll have a further discussion with some other guests. But first of all, I'm just going to ask anyone who's on this call and who's typing, please to mute themselves, because I hear a staccato noise in the background, which suggests that someone is taking notes or possibly catching up on their emails. So please mute yourself if you're not speaking. It's so topical, this, because we have seen such progress with the Magnitsky Act. I remember when Bill Browder first started this, and people thought it was utopian. It was unrealistic. I remember the Obama administration explaining in great detail and with tremendous emphasis how Magnitsky sanctions were both impossible, counterproductive, damaging, couldn't work. And thanks to the US Congress, we managed to get those Magnitsky sanctions through Congress and into law. And now it seems unimaginable that we were in a world where we didn't have Magnitsky sanctions. And then other countries have followed suit. Bill Browder's gone round to parliament after parliament, to national level, the European Parliament, elsewhere, lobbying and pushing and haranguing and cajoling and getting these sanctions onto the statute book. And it's made a real difference. Some of the worst people in the world can't now travel to the West. They can't have assets in the West. They're scared of what's going to happen to them in the West. And that is tremendous progress. But on the other hand, we see the kleptocrats and the authoritarians fighting back. And in a way, I think what Lukashenko did at the weekend is a kind of it's his version of a Magnitsky Act. You stop a plane that's going through your airspace, you bring it down with a bogus terrorist threat, and then you incarcerate two of the people on board with these bogus charges, facing perhaps a death penalty or long imprisonment, and then put up these kind of grotesque hostage videos just to underline your point. So we're in a battle. We have our ammunition, they have theirs, but we're not done yet. We have plenty more we can do, and that's what we're going to talk about in our event today. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to my friend Petros Austrevicius, who's from the Renew Europe group, but we're very bipartisan here. We'll have other groups in the European Parliament talking soon. Petros, give us your perspective on where we are and perhaps more importantly, where you'd like us to be.
Thank you, Edward, very much. And indeed, dear Raphael, Radoslav, Bill, those with whom we have had a previous meeting, and welcome back once again on this most important issue as Magnitsky Act. So you remember, we met on the 18th of November 2020. Back then, we talked about the EU Magnitsky Act as such. In December 2020, the European Union approved the human rights sanction regime, the European Magnitsky Act, as I would call a major step forward. Edward, you're completely right. Not many believed that we can move from that stuck position. But, ladies and gentlemen, no corruption as a crime against human rights was included into this regime. So we have to repeat once again, clearly and loudly, corruption as a devastating, far-reaching effect deprives citizens from human rights related goods and services and creates indeed security and malign interference threats to the countries where the plundered funds are directed. I have to admit that there are some good news in this regard, and already in June, this June, the European Parliament will discuss this issue again and again in its plenary session. The risk of corruption and authoritarian regimes in the world is on increase. Let's face it. So that's why I call on all of you and thanking for this great opportunity to discuss once again. Let's fight like Sergei Magnitsky. Let's achieve our full-scale European Magnitsky Act. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Petros, for that and for giving us both the forward-looking perspective and the important historical background. And I'm going to go straight on now to Raphael Glucksmann from the group of the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. Raphael, the floor is yours. But you may be muted.
Hey, everyone. Can you unmute me?
We can hear you.
Thank you, Edward. I don't know if you hear me well because I had trouble hearing you. It's a great way to game and to host this event. What a long path has been moved forward and achieved.
Raphael, we've got terrible problems. We can't hear you. Your broadband is really not working. Raphael, I think I'm going to have to ask you to reconnect. I think Raphael, we're really not hearing you at all. So I'm going to ask the organisers to mute you and see if we can get back to you on a different connection, possibly with just audio rather than video. And in the meantime, we'll go to Radek. Radek, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Go ahead. Let's see. Radek Sikorski from Poland.
Look, I don't want to preach to you because, I mean, the people that I see on the screen, I don't think need to be convinced that grand corruption goes hand in hand usually with human rights abuses, and in fact often enables those kinds of regimes to come to power. Let's remember how the KGB brought themselves back to power in the Russian Federation after the Soviet KGB stashed away money abroad. And we know how many African satraps and people like Lukashenko, in fact, keep their money abroad. What I would be keen on is that we cover with these sanctions not just the people doing the abuses, but also their family members and significant others, because these abusers of human rights usually keep their money under somebody else's name. I mean, Putin uses his some kind of violinist, yeah. Lukashenko probably sends
a cellist. Sorry.
Right. Lukashenko uses his eldest son. So we need the spouses, the children, and significant others, because it's sometimes mistresses, and that's tricky, I know, but I think would be important. And secondly, we need an enforcement mechanism, both on internal tax havens inside the European Union, but also on external ones. because Swiss bank accounts are not what they used to be. None of these guys, if they're sane, keep their money in the EU. They keep it these days in Singapore or Dubai or many other places. But we need an enforcement mechanism, and for that, I think we probably need the cooperation of the United States, which has a unique insight into the global financial system. Because these sanctions should not be symbolic; they should have teeth. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that. I think this idea of going after the spouses, siblings, significant others, and so on is very interesting. Although there's always the question of what one do you have some sort of exception for people who hate their ex-spouse or parents or whatever. But I think there's also the question of the enablers, which is really important, and because none of this would work if it wasn't for the bankers, lawyers, and accountants in the West who funnel the money into assets, do accounting dodges in order to make it look right, and then have lawyers to make it all look legal. And I think if we could go after the enablers, that would be a very powerful tool, and perhaps we can get onto that a bit in the discussion. But Bill, I want to come to you next, because you are the author of the Magnitsky sanctions, and I'm sure you're both pleased with what you've achieved, but also yearning to do more. So give us a few minutes on where you are and what you think the most important thing we could do to get even more success in the future.
Well, I thanks for the credit, but all the people on this call are also very much deserve credit for what's happened. Petrus, Radek, Raphael, Chris Bryant, Vladimir, everybody has played a role in the rollout of Magnitsky sanctions around the world, and I'm honored to be working with all of you in this important mission. Sergei Magnitsky was killed because he uncovered a $230 million corruption scheme. And if we just sanctioned the people who tortured him, then we would only get half of the people involved in the whole thing. They killed him because of money. And so by definition, based on the name of the legislation, it should have the people who do the torturing and the withholding of medical attention and that type of stuff. And they should also have the people who financially benefited from it. And when I went around the world arguing for this, my arguments made sense in the United States, and they have corruption and human rights in the US Magnitsky Act. And in Canada, the same thing. In the UK, they first did just human rights abuse. And then very recently, just a few weeks ago, they added corruption. And so the one place we're missing is the European Union. And so it's not just a question of principle, it's a question of effective enforcement around the world. If the United States, Canada, and the UK will sanction certain people who are involved in corruption, and the EU can't, then that's a huge deficiency in the overall global enforcement scheme. And so the EU really needs to sort of come up to par. And I describe the EU's Magnitsky Act as a half Magnitsky Act because it doesn't include the corruption. And there's very good reason why it doesn't include the corruption, and the same reason why Magnitsky's name isn't formally on the EU Magnitsky Act, which is there are some states, some member states in the European Union. I will name a few. Hungary, as a prime example, that didn't want Magnitsky's name and doesn't want corruption. And so we have to figure out how we can put pressure on these member states so that the majority of the member states that probably do want corruption, and I know do want corruption, can overcome this. And so the EU isn't sort of shackled by this unanimity requirement that's sort of messing everything up. And
Bill, can I just ask you, from that point of view, has Brexit been an advantage? Has Brexit allowed Britain to do things that it wouldn't have been able to do before, while it was still a member of the EU?
Very much so on this particular issue. I mean, I can't travel with my pet to Europe, which is a big headache. But as far as the Magnitsky Act goes, we got everything rolled out much quicker here, and got things fixed much quicker here in terms of adding corruption than at the EU. And we're not constrained. You know, the British foreign policy is not being held up by hijacked by Russian-friendly member states. And this is really a very crucial thing, and it's becoming more crucial. So if we look at the case of Alexei Navalny right now. So Alexei Navalny has been, they tried to kill him, they then arrested him, they then are effectively torturing him. And he made it clear that if we sanction a few more people in the deputy ministers here or whatever, that's not going to have an effect. We need to go after the oligarchs who fund the Putin regime. And we can't do that in the European Union right now because the oligarchs who fund the Putin regime, we're never going to get them on human rights abuse. We can only get them on corruption. And that's just one example of many out there that we need to be thinking about.
Chris Bryant, who is going to be part of the second half of this program in the discussion, has just jumped in to say that he thinks the UK was not prevented from doing Magnitsky sanctions by being a member of the EU. But we'll park that issue for now. We can get back to it possibly later on.
Lithuania did it while being a member of the EU.
Say again, Radek?
Lithuania did it while being a member of the EU. Yeah, London has been a money laundering center for about 200 years, well, way before joining the European Union.
We have no one from the City of London here to defend themselves, and I'm sure they would leap at the chance.
I can jump in and attack them some more if necessary.
Well, but I think that, I mean, one of the points here is that money flows downhill to the weakest point, and you've been we've put a lot of attention into what used to be called the sunny places for shady people, the sort of offshore jurisdictions, and that's they're politically not particularly strong, and it's quite easy to beat up on Vanuatu or Nauru or places like that. But I think in terms of the bulk of the money laundering, it certainly happens in the onshore jurisdictions, and that certainly includes the City of London. But Petrus, we're coming to the end of this sort of opening salvo from the MEPs, and I'm very sorry we still don't have Raphael. The broadband has let him down. I don't know where he is. But Petrus, come back and give. Just want to respond to any of the points that either Radek or Bill made, and then we'll move on to the rest of the discussion.
Well, Edward, I think good points were made. I think we are on the right track. I feel among my colleagues, and by the way, in Renew Europe, we had a very substantial discussion on this issue. And there is very general understanding that corruption must be included into the European Magnitsky Act. Well, I strongly believe this is a matter of time. I do see some risks arriving from the single member state side. Indeed, I mean, at the council level, we might have a certain resistance against this, but I think we have to build up a very strong lobby from the political side. I mean, just to blame and shame those politicians and countries which might stand on our way. And I strongly believe that it's just a matter of time. Excuse me.
Right, and Radek, let me finally go to you for this segment, and just give us you know the United States very well. How do you read the opening months of the Biden administration from this point of from this point of view? Do you think we'll have more support from the United States than we did under President Trump, or is it going to be the same, or should we be just getting on with what we want to do regardless of the United States? Radek, are you still there? I think you're on mute, Radek.
Yeah, well, okay. I did obey and muted myself. Well, Nord Stream, I think, will go ahead, and that will mean there'll be more corruption in Germany. I mean, let's remember that gas trading was the major source of corruption in Ukraine, and now this will shift to Germany, where they've corrupted the former chancellor already. But putting that aside, I think Biden's offer of a global 21% corporation tax, which is now being finessed to 14 or 15%, means that the US also wants to get hold of some of the money that's hidden away in tax havens, and we should take him up on it and have a global regime. Look, tax havens were never created by legislation. These are just clever lawyers using loopholes in legislation, and we should just close the loopholes. We can pass legislation which makes it illegal to have accounts, either corporate or individual, in tax havens. We can bar companies based in tax havens or with shareholding in tax havens from public procurement. There is all sorts of stuff we can do if there's a will. And I think we all need the money to pay off the pandemia debts. So this is the best moment to do it.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you particularly for mentioning the wonderful subject of gas trading. And I'm glad we have Vladimir Milov, who is a former Russian energy minister, knows this subject absolutely backwards. And it's so frustrating as a journalist. One wants to write about these things, and then if you do, you get sued for libel, and it's very expensive and inconvenient. So I'd be absolutely thrilled if some parliament somewhere would launch a big inquiry into the history of the Russian energy complex and its interaction with world energy markets and price fixing and these things, because there's a great deal to come out there that we don't know. But I'm going to now thank our MEP hosts, Petros Astravicius, Raphael Glucksmann, who sadly couldn't join us because of technical issues, Radek Sikorski, and then Bill Browder, who is not an MP or an MEP, but is the intellectual author of the Magnitsky campaign. And we're going to move on now to a panel discussion. I have to say, for those of you who tuned in hoping to see Vera Jourova, who's Vice President of the European Commission for Values and Transparency, and one of the pillars of the pro-democracy, anti-corruption cause. She was sadly unable to join us on this occasion, although we hope we'll be able to see her again soon. But I'm now going to introduce the rest of the panel, the next four people, who will talk until about 1:45, and then I will hand over to the MEPs again for some final words. So our panel, four panelists are Chris Bryant, who is an MP from the United Kingdom from the Labour Party, and has been a formidable critic of the Putin regime and of global corruption, and a great ally to our cause. We have Laure Briard, who is a senior policy officer for Transparency International, EU, and an expert in the interaction between corruption and human rights. We have Elaine Ryan, a human rights and anti-corruption researcher. I'm sorry? I think someone is not muted and is talking in the background. Elaine Ryan is a human rights and anti-corruption researcher who's particularly keen on making the case for the addition of corruption to be added to Article 2 of the Magnitsky Act. And then finally, we've got, as I mentioned already, Vladimir Milov, who's a Russian politician, brackets retired, economist, former Deputy Minister of Energy. And he is going to tell us about the situation in Russia and how the Magnitsky sanctions on corruption would further bite into the power system in Vladimir Putin's Russia. So I'm going to go in the order which I mentioned the speakers. Chris, kick us off with the look at the UK anti-corruption regime, such as it is. It's not great, but it's better than nothing. How it might get better.
Well, in many ways, one of the strengths of the UK is one of its biggest weaknesses when it comes to dealing with authoritarian regimes elsewhere around the world, because we have a free press, we have a democratic system, our word is our bond, is an important part of the way we do our business, and we have a secure economic system, all of which means that people love coming to the UK to be able to do their financial business, however dodgy that may be. They can normally find really helpful lawyers who can ensure that whatever assets they have can be squirreled away rather conveniently in the UK. Oh, incidentally, I should add, we have a housing market which is ludicrously overpriced, and consequently, it's quite easy to launder money simply by buying a house for less than it's, for more than it's actually worth. Some of those lawyers and accountants and financial companies have already been found guilty over the last few years of effectively enabling money laundering in the UK. And on top of that, we have a whole archipelago. It's not strictly speaking an archipelago, but a whole series of islands, some close to and some much further away, all of which operate a variety of different trust arrangements and a variety of different financial secrecy arrangements, which make it much easier for people to hide money that they've acquired by dodgy means. And the government still in the UK, whilst the government, I applaud Dominic Raab, with whom I used to do business a lot when he was a backbencher, for the work they've done on introducing the Magnitsky Act and introducing the financial corruption elements of it as well. We've still found that there have hardly been any unexplained wealth orders that have been taken through the courts. We still have
Sorry, Chris, just back up a moment. For those of you who don't know what an unexplained wealth order is, just remind people what they are and what the hopes were.
Well, the hope was that when you see somebody who has very significant wealth in the multi-millions approaching the billions, and there is no clear, evident, manifest means by which they have earned that, legal assumptions can be made in this country about that person having, if they can't prove how they've earned it, that they must have earned it by some dodgy criminal means, and consequently that they could be, those assets could be frozen or subsequently taken off them. So far, that hasn't been a very effective legal measure, I think would be the best way of describing it. Bill may know more about that than I do, and not because he's got significant assets which he's earned by some dodgy means, but simply because I think he's worked alongside of some of these issues. Why I think it's really important that you deal with all of these issues in the round is because corruption, criminality, human rights abuses, anti-democratic movements, and authoritarian regimes, all of that is a single seamless garment. All the things go together. And normally you find, if you look at the history of any authoritarian figure around the world, they might have entered into politics in a perfectly legitimate way, and then wealth beckons, and then they start slipping into moderate versions of corruption, and then so as to hold on to their position, they have to engage in anti-democratic measures like repressing the free press and arresting dissidents, or bringing down airplanes when they're flying over your territory, simply so as to take somebody off them. Invariably, there's a great deal of criminality at the end of it. And the biggest problem for everybody in other countries is that that person has to lock themselves in, because otherwise, the moment they leave power, they're in danger of going to prison themselves. So that, I think, is the fundamental challenge for us.
Super. Thanks so much indeed for that, Chris. And we'll get into some of the details more in the discussion. And I'm going to straight on to you, Laura, from TI, as I call it. I think you still abbreviate it to TI, don't you? Give us your been, is it 30 years TI has been going, getting corruption onto the political agenda. And rather like Bill Browder, you were seen as sort of quixotic outsiders in the beginning, and now you're absolutely part of the international political mainstream, which is satisfying. But on the other hand, there's still a great deal to do. Give us your take.
Thanks, Edward. Yeah, so perhaps just to start with a quick word on TI, as you said, Transparency International, which is a global movement present in more than 100 countries, engaged in the fight against corruption. And as such, we've been following quite closely the negotiations around the adoption of this new regime, which regrettably doesn't include corruption as a standalone criterion. It would still be possible to include cases on a case-by-case basis, but it would have been so much more convenient. For example, if you look at the US, in the US case, it's worth mentioning that more than half of the cases of individuals that are listed are on corruption grounds. So it would have actually facilitated the work, the anti-corruption, the fight against corruption. So the new regime adopted in December, the EU missed a golden opportunity to address grand corruption. And and to align with what seems to be becoming the norm. As was mentioned before, the US, the UK, Canada have one already. The Australians are also discussing the opportunity to adopt one. And so it's not only about missing an opportunity, but it's also it's becoming a risk for the EU to become the favorite destination and a safe haven for the corrupt that will not be able to hide their ill-gotten gains in the US, the UK, or Canada. So just to illustrate this point on how sanctions are more effective if they are done in a multilateral way, our partners, Global Witness and the Platform for the Protection of Whistleblowers in Africa, PPLAAF, a horrible acronym, well, difficult acronym to pronounce. They have identified a case which perfectly illustrates the risk for Europe and how the lack of multilateralism tend to undermine sanctions and reduce their effectiveness. So you probably all have heard about Dan Gertler. He's an Israeli businessman who is accused of making his fortune through corrupt mining deals in DRC. And he was sanctioned by the US in 2017 under the US Global Magnitsky. And apparently he managed to evade what sanction using an international money laundering network stretching from DRC to Europe and Israel. So here we clearly see that to circumvent US sanction, Gertler started making deals in euro using European entities. So this really shows how non-alignment with global standards can make the EU more vulnerable to corruption and financial crime. So it's not just, again, missing an opportunity. It's also potentially increasing the risk for Europe. Just so to say that multilateralism and having a horizontal regime would be perfect to actually address a problem which is transnational in nature, with illicit money moving through international markets. So having a horizontal regime here would have been very relevant. Now, if I just like cybersecurity, terrorism, chemical weapons, which already have their horizontal regime. So now if I want to provide a few examples that in a way would not be captured with the current regime, or it would be more difficult to capture them, but would have been captured if there was corruption including as a standalone criterion. I think there are many cases actually of kleptocrats that have abused their power to siphon out and squander public resources to the detriment of the whole population. So for now, the Council has considered that the violation of socio-economic rights was not serious enough. But if we look at the consequences of grand corruption, it's the whole population that's affected and deprived of their rights. So the EU should be looking not only at the depth of human rights violation, but at the breadth, like affecting massively a population. So as I said, there are many cases from Isabel dos Santos in Angola being subject to to the Gupta family in South Africa, or Tripep in Cambodia. Another recent example that perfectly illustrates, it's not so recent when you look at corruption, the corrupt conduct, but more recent in the media, that really illustrate the link between corruption and human rights violation is the current Lebanese situation. Lebanon is going through a tragic humanitarian crisis, and it's the result of decades of rampant corruption and negligence from the political elite. Civil society is really now mobilized on this issue, trying to get the EU to sanction some members of this political class. You've got also a complaint that has been filed in France against some members of this political elite, including the central bank governor Riyad Salameh. You've also Human Rights Watch is trying to get the UN to adopt a resolution to implement a mechanism for an international investigation. So it's there is like the civil society is mobilized, and we're kind of waiting for you to respond. I don't know if I have a bit more time. I don't know. Can I say a few more words?
I think I'm going to stop you because we've been joined again, I think, by
okay.
Raphael Glucksmann has joined us by some
No
other means. It says Raphael via Zoom. And I don't know how much of the previous discussion you heard, Raphael, if you want to respond to any of those points or indeed make the points you wanted to make at the beginning. But either way, we're very happy to see see you here. And we hope that the electrons will flow a bit more obediently this time. But you're muted. You're muted, Raphael. We can't hear you.
Ah. You cannot hear me, but I can perfectly hear you now.
Now we can hear you. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Great. Well, I'm so sorry about this. It's the first time it arrives at the end, I hope, of the pandemic and this virtual world. And I did not hear what was said, so I don't want to repeat what other people have said. But for sure, the past is not complete as long as corruption is out of the scheme. So you can count on us to really wage a fight in the parliament to make sure that corruption is taken on board. Why? Because it's, as I just heard, it's a weapon of mass destruction against society and population, but also because anti-corruption struggle is a tool in our hands. You know, we are just asking ourselves how we can restore the credibility of the European Union when it comes to kleptocracies like Russia. And the struggle against corruption is our weapon. And if we start to be serious on it, then we will be taken seriously by kleptocratic regime. And this is of the utmost importance. As we have seen now, the credibility of EU is endangered, it's very weak. And a dictator in Minsk can decide that it's worth it, kidnapping, hijacking a civilian European plane in order to kidnap a journalist. So we have a lack of credibility, and we can restore it if we start going after people who rob their own nations and spend their money in our places. And this is an absolute decisive moment, and I'm very happy to join, even if I'm so sorry about disturbing technical problems. But as the conversation go on now, and
well, thank you so quite. And Raphael, it's so frustrating because we're hearing you as if you're whispering. I feel almost that the kind of Grand Corruption International Cyber Squad has intervened to try and stop you getting your message across. But just to summarize, the point that Raphael was making, and it's a very important one, is that this isn't just about making life difficult for the perpetrators of grand corruption. It's also about our self-respect, our image within our own societies, that if we don't tackle corruption properly, our own people lose faith in the rule of law and the institutions and our ability to run our societies fairly. So it's not just, as Raphael said, it's a weapon of mass destruction directed inside our societies. But I want to leave some time for the discussion, so I'm going to shoot straight on now to Elaine Ryan. So someone's just asking, who are the Grand Corruption Cyber Squad? I have to stress, I made that up. They don't exist, or at least if they do exist, I don't know about them. That was just my fanciful way of explaining why Raphael was not able to get his message across. Elaine, give us your take as someone who looks very closely at these issues, and perhaps in particular, could you explain why it's so difficult to get corruption into the Magnitsky sanction list of crimes? It would seem from outside that this is an absolute no-brainer.
Yes and no, and I'd like to say I'm looking at this from researcher's point of view, but I was human rights professional before that. So I worked for state and international organizations before going on to this topic of corruption and human rights. And point is, for a very long time, these were two completely separate communities. You'd have a human rights community and an anti-corruption community, and they're completely different words. And so there was for a very long time disbelief from one to the other. And it's still there to some extent. But as you said at the beginning, you know, there was a time when the Obama administration didn't want the Magnitsky Act and was saying, how can we be with it? And now how can we be without it? Many things have moved on. It's a bit of a cogwheel that you cannot turn back. Things are moving. The awareness on this issue, that how interlinked corruption and human rights are, as in human rights violations and corrupt acts, but also human rights prevention and anti-corruption work. These work together. So there is this awareness. It's among experts like you and me, but it's also in the public awareness because of all the advances on the various scandals that come up in the world, and that we can now it's so much easier to get information on and have an opinion about it. So it's a bit like things cannot really go back in the awareness and in whether or not it's possible to separate these two communities. And now we're at a point where so many institutions work on corruption and human rights, but you will always find everywhere people who are reluctant to change. But it's still happening. The European Court of Human Rights is working on it. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights is working on it. The OECD, from its anti-corruption point of view, is working on human rights. And bit by bit, it's changing. That's really what I want to say, that things are moving. I also think it wouldn't be that difficult to include corruption into the existing act, because the EU and states within the EU are changing their legislation on so many connected issues. Human rights defenders, whistleblowers, but not only, asset return for grand corruption, like it's happened in France following the Procès de Bien Malaki, but also corporate due diligence in different states, in different forms, France, Germany, Netherlands. So these things are changing bit by bit, and they're all connected. The different types of Magnitsky Act, like someone mentioned Latvia before, and somehow there needs to be a harmonization of what different states are doing and what the EU is doing with one hand, and that it can advance with the other hand as well, just to be harmonized. It just makes sense. And the last point I want to make, and that was already mentioned before, is that at this point there needs to be sanctions on the enablers. What makes corruption and human rights violation work so much together is that there are people at the center of this who make it possible. Accountants, bankers, realtors, car dealers, you name it, all these professions that for so long worked in areas where it felt like economic crime had no consequences on people. But now there is this awareness that even these white crimes or crimes that seem just about money do actually have direct impacts on people in so many different ways, in the way that was mentioned just by a law earlier in DRC or.
Well, thanks so much, particularly for mentioning the enablers, because, and I hope we can get onto that a bit more in the discussion that follows. But I want to bring Vladimir in, because you see this in Russia so up close from your position. I'd love to hear from you, when you look back at the last 20 years, how effective has all this stuff been, and what could we be doing differently, and what could we be doing more that would make it work better?
Thank you, Edward. And first, I would want to agree with Radek Sikorski in what he said, that corruption and human rights abuses, they go hand in hand. And I think it's a very weird idea to separate them in the first place, because why do dictators oppress human rights and political freedoms? This is done not just for the sake of love of art. Do it to protect the stolen money, so that the society cannot do anything with their collective money. So I think it's really important to understand how inseparable these things are. Interestingly, you know that Alexei Navalny team and myself, we have been promoting the idea to sanction Putin's oligarchs and enablers which has been mentioned many times earlier in this discussion, this is very important to understand. This is just not out of revenge against some personal wealthy individuals. These people are a crucial institution of Putin's kleptocratic system because the whole sense of the system is to steal money in Russia and store them safely in the West, where they are first protected by your institutions. They do not export capitals to other dictatorships because there is no rule of law. And in the West, I mean, they are so strong that they sue you for introducing sanctions. They sue you where you try to freeze their assets and so on. So they export corrupt capitals to the West because they are protected by Western institutions and property rights protection, independent judiciary, and all that. So this is why it's very important to break this link. So they will have no more opportunity to continue with the system of exporting dirty, corrupt money, keeping them safely in the West, and essentially expanding by trying to interfere and undermine Western democracies and corrupt everything which is around them. And also, when we have been discussing this idea about sanctioning Putin's oligarchs, European politicians have been saying, look, but we need to prove under the current EU Magnitsky regime that they are really involved in human rights abuses, not just corruption. Believe me, they all are. They all are simultaneously also involved in very specific human rights abuses. Like Alisher Usmanov, for instance, had sued the leaders of Navalny's anti-corruption foundation, Roman Rubanov and Ivan Zhdanov. Rubanov was forced to emigrate from Russia because of that pressure, and Zhdanov was convicted, which had also interrupted his ability to run into State Duma elections. These were all Usmanov's lawsuits. Also, interestingly, I think there's not enough airplay about how this guy, Alisher Usmanov, got his money. Edward, I'm sure, and Bill know that, but 20 years ago, he was the head of subsidiary of Gazprom, which owned an iron ore factory and a steel factory. And he literally sold it to himself under undisclosed conditions, which are still undisclosed to this day. So these factories belong to Gazprom, to a subsidiary shared by Usmanov. All of a sudden, they ended up in Usmanov's personal hands. And he began buying Arsenal football clubs and something. Deripaska had sued Alexei Navalny and put a lot of legal pressure on anti-corruption foundation as well. Abramovich is not just a wealthy guy, but he's the guy who was serving for like a decade and a half for first as a governor under Putin, then as a chairman of regional parliament, contributing to authoritarian build-up and power grab by Putin. So they all are simultaneously involved, not only in corruption, but also in human rights abuses. If you need proof, we'll be happy to provide that. But I think that it's wrong in the first place to actually place this firewall and break this link between corruption and abuse of human rights. This link is fundamental, and we can present a lot of proof behind that. But of course, it is essential that Western reaction to whatever damage Putin is doing domestically and internationally, and not only Putin but other dictators, it is important that it takes note of this important link between stolen wealth and behavior. And one last thing which I wanted to finish with is I want to go back to discussion between Edward and Bill on impact of Brexit. Because listen, I think it's London, not Europe, not the continental Europe, which is the champion in providing safe haven for this corrupt, stolen Russian money. So it's time to do something. Yes, we've been hearing a lot about the unexplained wealth orders. Now that you're liberated from this entangling superstate in Brussels, we would really welcome that Britain stops just talking and finally do something about going after this really unexplained and, believe me, corrupt wealth of many Putin-linked billionaires who effectively reside in London. I think it's time to do something about it.
Thanks so much, Vladimir. And I want to come back to Chris, but I'm going to say, please can we park the Brexit question, because I think the danger is it takes over the entire discussion, and a crime is a crime before or after Brexit. And I think that there's so many. You're absolutely right to focus on London. I feel really ashamed as a British citizen here that London is not only the money laundering capital, but it's also the lawfare capital. Someone is not muted and is talking, so please, whoever you are, mute, unless you want to make a very coherent point, which will also be welcome. There's also this business of lawfare, the legal intimidation of critics. Bills been subject to this and fought off a legal intimidation attempt. I've personally run the defence in an extremely expensive libel action in which it cost us £500,000 just not to lose. Although it was a tremendous result, we still £500,000 is quite a lot of money. And these slaps, these strategic lawsuits against public participation, are one of the best weapons in the kleptocrats' arsenal. And the English and actually also Irish libel law is a really favourable jurisdiction for this. And we see right now Catherine Belton, the author of the fantastic book Putin's People, which is a really good expose of the whole history of corruption and abuse and the KGB tentacles on power in Russia. She's facing an immensely expensive libel suit from people who she's touched on in her book. So, Chris, obviously you're an opposition politician, and it's natural for you to blame the government, but try to be bipartisan about it. What can we realistically expect from the British authorities here in terms of turning Britain from being a sort of hotspot of oligarchic influence and kleptocracy into a place that might resist it?
I would happily read Catherine Belton's book out in Parliament just to give it parliamentary privilege. If that weren't to be thought of as an abuse of parliamentary privilege, I completely agree with you about the point about enablers. It's very depressing that British lawyers would want to make themselves available at almost like a taxi cab for hire, but not on the basis of the next person, but on the basis of who's got the deepest pockets. Look, there is still considerably more that the government could do. They're going to have to find a new way of doing unexplained wealth orders that actually is more effective. I've spoken to several ministers, and I know that they're trying to work on something around that. We'll see. They've promised a new bill on a kind of foreign lobbying act. I hope that that's going to be strong enough, because one of the other tentacles that we've not referred to is that sometimes, of course, authoritarian regimes spent a lot of time and money on gaining access to politicians in other. I think we have to be very mindful of how that affects the British parliamentary and democratic system. I just say one thing. It's not really about Brexit, but it's just I'm minded because Radek is sitting there, and Radek and I were Europe ministers for our respective countries at the same time, and we used to have dinner together, all the Europe ministers, and it was really useful. I mean, I'm still a passionate pro-European, and I will be until I die. I think we British people, Britain, who can be phenomenally irritating in our presumption that we're better than everybody else. But I think we can be phenomenally useful sometimes when we add weight to an argument that everybody else in Europe would quite like to take. I worry now that the EU will splinter. Radek's already referred to, well, you know, there are several former very senior politicians, both former commissioners and other political leaders in Europe, who've ended up taking the Putin shilling or the Nord Stream shilling. And I just worry that the UK's absence from that table may not help. So I hope that Europe will find a way of enabling us still always to be part of the discussions about strengthening attitudes towards authoritarian regimes and financial and personal corruption around the world.
Just at bottom, let me say that there's no shortage of people taking Russian gold in London either. Yeah?
Oh no, that's one area in which we are not exceptional, Radek. no, except you could argue that we're worse than anywhere. And oddly, this point I made earlier about the housing market is a key aspect of this, because you can, if you've got £10 million to get rid of, as it were, or to launder. Easiest thing in the world is to buy a house for £3 million, which is worth £3 million for 10 million, because you've laundered 3 million, and it's safe in a place which nobody's ever going to take it off you. To do something about that.
Thanks, Chris. Radek, I'm going to ask you. I mean, I would love to see you and Chris just discussing one-on-one. But we're going to come back to our MEPs and Bill Browder for the final 50-minute segment. But I want to come back to the panel a bit and talk a bit more about the sort of specific issues. And I think one thing that really strikes me is the balance between going after the individual and going after the structures. And it's quite easy and satisfying to say, individual X is responsible for the death of Magnitsky or bringing down a Belarusian a flight to making it land at Minsk airport and so on. And that's is an important part of the armory. But I think that in the grand corruption, it's also about the corporate structures, the anonymous beneficial ownership, which we've just touched on, but I would like to have a bit more discussion on the idea that you can have a company where you don't really know who owns it. And then the role of the enablers, the bankers, lawyers, and accountants, who actually fit this money and these corporate structures into the so-called respectable economy. And so I worry a bit that if we focus too much on the sort of gratifying business of going after individuals, it's a bit of it's like that, the whack-a-mole. You hit one, but there are 3 others popping up all over the place, and we need to take a sort of systemic approach. So let me come back to the some of the members of the panel. Let's start with you, Vladimir. When you look at this, how much of this is systemic and how much of this is individuals?
I think I unmuted myself. Listen, I think over the Putin's 20 years, it became more and more systemic, because just take a look at the ranking of the Russian businesses, like RBC 500 ranking. So all the individuals, like the 35 oligarchs that we're talking about, they essentially control the biggest chunk of Russian strategic industries. And so this is not about, again, this is not about targeting some specific individuals, specific people who have done wrong things. Putin's system was about establishing strategic control over major industries and capitalizing on stolen cash flows from these industries. So this, at the same time, institutional. When we say Abramovich or Usmanov or Shuvalov, we really mean institutions, because names on them can be very easily replaced. The essence of Putin's system is monopolizing control over cash flows through the biggest strategic corporations, which are his allies, and effectively, in a lot of cases, effectively controlled by Putin and his cronies. So I think, Edward, I think it's really intertwined to the point where we shouldn't really go separating individual from systemic. This is the way it works in autocracies. Actually, all the wealth ending up in the hands of the very few people, Putin's cronies, who are linked to the dictators. This Catherine Belton, by the way, brilliantly explains this in her book, Putin's People. So I think you're right that we need to target systemic institutions, but I think let's not go too far in trying to create artificial differences between the two, because they are so much intertwined.
Super. I think I've just had a message. I hope it's a current one, that Raphael wants to join us. We've now lost him by video, but perhaps the audio will work. Am I right, Raphael? Did you want to say something? Total silence. Okay. Well, let's take a rain check on that one, and let me go to let's go to Larry from TI, because Larry, you've got the problem with that if you have a system that is actually corrupt, where corruption is not a problem within the system, but the whole system is corrupt, as in Russia, it's difficult for a place like TI to get a point of purchase. You look at the railways, corrupt; energy sector, corrupt; infrastructure, corrupt; public administration, corrupt. There's not a sort of non-corrupt part of the society. So it's hard to know which bit to attack first. How do you get around that?
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good question, and an argument we've heard quite a bit or so from members in the council, saying, well, for grand corruption, it's hard to single out individuals; it's the whole system, so that wouldn't be working as well as much as it would for human rights abuses. But I think it's like US sanctions against individuals is like an entry door. It's just introducing a grain of sand in the machinery, and we've been talking a lot about enablers, but enablers, banks and etc. are expected to actually be doing checks and controls on their customers, and if these people are on EU sanctions or US sanctions, they shouldn't be doing transactions with them. So it's sanctions against individuals are also a way to address the problem with enablers. And if enablers, or if banks and other non-financial professions enter into business with these people, they should actually be sanctioned for non-compliance with AMA obligation, or even for criminal charges of complicity with corrupt individuals, or complicity in financial crime. So EU sanctions against individuals is still a way to address the system indirectly. So I wouldn't just rule it out just because it wouldn't address the system, the whole system. And actually, we've been talking with a lot of legal experts that it's possible to define a system. This kind of problems can be resolved. There's no real legal obstacle to building such sanctions. It's more like a question of political will.
Thanks for that. I noticed in the chat there's a lot of messages from Kazakhstan, mostly in Russian, just saying very plaintively that we don't have the right to vote. We live in a dictatorship. Please help us. The EU should do something. And I'm not sure there's any particular answer we've got for Kazakhstan, but I think it's important to remember this isn't just we talk a lot about Russia, and that's right, but this is also, we have problems with regard to Azerbaijan, with Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. Many other countries in the region, and indeed around the world. But the common thread is it all comes back to Western capitals. Bill wants to have a word about the enablers, but Bill, I'm going to ask you to wait, because we do have we've got sort of 15 minutes at the end for you and the MEPs to jump in on that. And I just wanted to go to Elaine. So I think, did you have your hand up, or were you just trying to make your headphones work? I can't see.
No, yeah, I just moved my headphones. That's all.
I'm sorry. I thought you were trying to attract. Well, you've attracted my attention anyway. So do you want to say something?
No, really, I was just listening. I mean, I share your point on enablers, and I share all the points that were made.
Okay, well, let's move on to enablers then, Bill, because it is such an important subject. So make your point now, and let's have a quick 10 minutes on, because there's a fundamental problem here that in our systems, which are basically fair, people have the right to legal representation. Even the worst criminal in the world, even at the Nuremberg trials, people had defense counsel. So any individual can say, I have the right to a lawyer. And of course, once you have the right to a lawyer and you have deep pockets, then you have the right to a very good lawyer, and good lawyers are really good at doing all sorts of things to delay justice and intimidate the other side. And so it immediately becomes a fight which is loaded in the favor of the rich. People have the right, people say, I can hire a PR company, and there's no legal regulation of PR, there's no legal regulation of private investigators, so they can start trying to investigate the other side. You get you open a bank account and you say, I have the right to open a bank account, surely, even if I'm an aluminium magnate. I made my money in aluminium. What's wrong with that? Why can't I be treated fairly? So, Bill, how do we deal with this tension between the inherent fair-mindedness of the Western system and the fact that people use this fair-mindedness to attack us?
Well, so you're right that if you're in a if you're being accused of a criminal conduct, you have the right to an attorney, or if you maybe have been victimized, you have the right to hire an attorney to try to get justice. But there's no rule anywhere of fairness that you're entitled to hire a member of the House of Lords to lobby against Magnitsky sanctions. There's no sort of ethical duty to do that, and moreover, as Chris mentioned earlier in the conversation, at the moment people can take money without even declaring it, and so how do you fix this problem where all this money is sloshing into the hands? And I should point out that like 9 out of 10 people that are approached say no, but the Russians approach everybody and have no shame, and 1 out of 10 will say yes, and so they end up with the Schroders and others like that in different countries around the world. But how do you deal with all this? And the answer is there are rules in some places. Then hopefully there'll be more rules in the future, which should be enforced. And all you need to do is enforce a couple of rules in a couple of places before everybody starts running for the hills. And so, like, for example, there are anti-money laundering rules that exist in most countries. Yet, Danske Bank was responsible for laundering $230 billion over a 10-year period from Russia and other Soviet states. Why did they do that? Because there was a 400 and some odd % return on equity in their Estonian branch for doing that. And nobody thought that there'd be any consequences. And so the moment somebody goes to jail, all of a sudden everybody runs for the hills. And I just wanted to say that today, this was a very big day for us in the Magnitsky campaign. The Latvian authorities seized, not just froze, but seized an apartment in the old town of Riga that belonged to somebody who received it from the Kluyev organized crime, received the money from the Kluyev organized crime group to buy the apartment. And they bought the apartment specifically to get a residence permit in Latvia. And even though the value of it was only $230,000, I would argue that one action by the police, by law enforcement authorities, will probably scare 1,000 other people from doing a similar thing. And so all it takes is a little bit of enforcement. And just to finish up on the unexplained wealth orders, it's the best law that could ever happen, and it's been completely mismanaged by the British law enforcement agency. So the unexplained wealth orders, for anyone who doesn't know, is a piece of legislation which says that instead of the government having to prove that you got your money illegally from a bad source, which means going back to Russia or Kazakhstan or someplace, yes. Instead, you just have to, if it looks suspicious, you've got to prove that it came from a legitimate source. And so guess what? The UK law enforcement agencies, what do they do with this thing? Whenever there's a dictator that's going around after one of its enemies in the UK, the Serious Fraud Office, or the National Crime Agency, will then do the mopping up operation for the dictator in London going after one of their enemies. That's what they've done on a number of occasions. None of these people were dissidents. These were just, none of these people were members of the regime. They were probably, and I wouldn't say dissidents, but these were people who had fallen out with the regime. And so the UK authorities were going after enemies of the Aliyevs and enemies of the Moldovan government, and et cetera, et cetera. And so, so far, it's never been used to go after the Aliyev family, for example.
Bill, you're being afflicted by the same gremlins that have already cost us Raphael's participation. So some of that broke. I think the most important point, just to summarize for those who couldn't hear, is one has to end the climate of impunity. That once you only have to go after one bad person and 99 bad people start rethinking their activities. And it's when people feel there are no consequences to their collaboration with kleptocrats, start making this really sort of goes off like wildfire. Pressure, professional disgrace, being banned for life for being a director of a public company. So I'm going to I'm just trying to work out who we should turn to next. We're sort of easing into the final Bill, can you hear me?
I now hear you. We went silent for a second there.
Okay, well, that's just there's obviously some terrible virus on the loose, which is attacking us all. So I was just saying that it's so important to go up the climate of impunity and traces of corruption, but also the accomplices. And in each, if you think you put your money in the West, you may lose it. That's a big stage, and no one can hear me.
We have sabotage.
We have sabotage. Radek, I'm going to turn to you because you're the only person who hasn't been sabotaged yet, and I want you to continue talking. I'm going to have to bail in a moment because I've got to go and do a. I'm giving evidence to a House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing on kleptocracy, which is, and I'm nervous now that my internet connection's falling down as well. But Radek, can you round up and give us your thoughts on the points that we've heard, and then perhaps after that we'll hear from Petros. Go ahead, Radek.
Well, I think we've all persuaded one another that this needs to be done, but I'd like to hear from Bill what the particular shape of the extension to cover corruption he would like to see so that it's more effective than the British variant. I'd like to know what to look out for in the process of formulating the EU legislation and the amendments that will inevitably be fielded. Thanks.
Can I answer that?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So the key issue is that even when we have corruption added to the legislation, which is going to be a heavy and hard fight, is that the European Union or the European Council won't use the legislation against any corrupt actors. And it's not, this wouldn't be unique to the EU, but I think it would be worse in the EU than it is in other countries because generally nobody likes to use this legislation because it causes people to get angry. And so what can we do to make that likely or to tip the scales more in the favor of justice? And the answer is some type of parliamentary oversight. And so, for example, in the United States, we knew this was coming when we did the Magnitsky Act there. And so we put in a provision called the congressional trigger. And the congressional trigger said that if the chairman and ranking member of certain committees, the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Intelligence Committee, Homeland Security Committee, were to write to the president and say, the following person should be sanctioned, then the president has 120 days to respond and say yay or nay. Now, obviously, that's not going to work in the same exact format in the EU, but something of that nature where the parliament has some oversight over the process or some ability to review and demand, it would be better than what will ultimately be a situation where we don't get anything. And the other thing I'd point out is that all of the vetoes that are happening from the Hungaries and the Cypruses of the world are all happening secretly. And if we could somehow open it up so there's not a secret deliberation at the European Council, but it's something transparent, that may solve some of the problems as well.
Well, thanks. So you've put your finger on a really important point there, Bill, which is the transparency. And sunlight is the best disinfectant, and both in terms of the decision making, but also in terms of source of funds and so on. Almost all the time, but not always, but most of the time, these people absolutely hate operating in public. Let's go very quickly. I assume you can hear me. Final word in case, Chris, did you want to say anything? And then we'll go to Petros to wind up before our electronic communications collapse completely, unless Vladimir wants to come in as well. But Chris, final words from you.
My only point is that I very much hope, as Bill knows, that we're going to be able to come up with a parliamentary system for being able to delineate people who should be on this list. Very similar to in the United States of America. And I'm working with conservative colleagues to try and make that happen fairly soon. But I would pay an enormous tribute to everybody who's had to stick their neck out on all of this stuff over the years. If you've not read Bill Browder's book, go out and buy it.
And if you've not read Catherine Belton's book, buy it while you still can. Incidentally, Bill, someone's put a message in the chat saying, "Aren't you scared of your life?" But I think that the fact you're here shows you're not. But we all applaud the bravery of the people who stand up to this. And as we see, the long arm of the kleptocrats reaches very deep inside our societies, and I guess you won't be taking any planes that cross Belarusian airspace anytime soon. But I'm going to just abbreviate this slightly, because we do. It's frustrating for the listeners to have so many bad connections, and I do apologise to Raphael particularly, because Raphael, you're such a great guy, and I so enjoy hearing your thoughts. It was really frustrating. If you raise your hand, anyone who wants to jump in, but otherwise I'm going to ask Petros, our sort of original host. Thank you so much for organising this. Thank you very much also to Dovile for her work behind the scenes, making it all happen. Your team is just great. And I'm going to hand over to you just to round up and give us some thoughts. And I'm going to jump off and head electronically to Washington, where I shall be telling the House Foreign Affairs Committee subcommittee on Europe what they should be doing to add some more American oomph to this great cause. So thanks again, Petros, and over to you.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you for great moderation and having this company discussing such a current issue. You know, I'm optimist. Look, so we have achieved so much in the last 7 months. I mean, looking back to the midst of 2020, we had no certainty whatsoever. I mean, what might happen with the Magnitsky Act? And here we are. I mean, we have already a kind of good start with the European Magnitsky Act. So I'm very optimistic. So by the end of 2021, we might have a much better version of European Magnitsky Act. Well, listening to Vladimir Milov, to other speakers, look, I mean, how much of evidence we should have more in order to convince politicians and those people in charge that corruption in foreign countries, which is all the time, I completely agree with all speakers, it's a direct abuse of human rights, is a matter of national security in our countries. What happens to that money, I mean, which comes to the Western side? I mean, in most cases, we probably not know exactly where they end up, what kind of the influence it might have on our domestic processes, on our politics, generally speaking. So that's why I consider it as a matter of national security. Probably we have to bring this aspect as well to our political system as much as we can. And, you know, I mean, we still speak about asking the European Union to approve and amend the European Magnitsky Act. Well, I wish to believe that at one day, the European Union will be a global promoter of this attitude, as corruption goes against human rights as much as it does, and will be a kind of, you know, a provision in all our international treaties and our dialogues with third countries and so on and so forth. So that's why, you know, thank you once again, Bill, Radek, Raphael, Edward, for moderating this short discussion. I'm sorry for poor quality of our interaction. It looks like not everybody, I mean, likes our discussion. I mean, there are so many means to block and to make our communication quality much worse. But nevertheless, look, I indeed of the opinion that inclusion of the corruption into Magnitsky Act, wherever it is, in US, UK, or EU, one day will be a new normal. And let's fight for this. Let's do everything possible. And thank you all who strongly believe that we are on the right course. Thank you so much to everybody of you.